Today's lecture will be on the cerebrum. Basically, when we're looking at the cerebral area, it would encompass the outer shell of the brain. It's mostly meant for memory and consciousness. Specifically with memory and consciousness, we know that not one single area can be assigned to memory and consciousness. We also know this area has hemisphere lateralization, which means that portions of the brain responsible for controlling speech, verbalization. We also know that any information coming from the left side of the body will be processed by the right hemisphere of the brain. So the first part we're going to discuss is going to be going over the simple definitions or simple areas of the brain. So the first one is going to be the frontal lobe. This is going to form the anterior part of the cerebral hemisphere, and it ends posterior to the central sulcus, so the deeper groove in the brain. And then the inferior portion is going to end at the lateral sulcus. So where these two lines come together, we would classify this anterior region as the frontal lobe. When we're looking at the frontal lobe, the first thing that we are going to talk about is going to be the primary motor cortex, which is basically the primary motor cortex is this blue region right here. It's also in the precentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus is simply a region where a mass of nervous tissue is immediately anterior of the central sulcus. But the primary motor cortex, this blue region, it's within this precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe, and these neurons control the voluntary skeletal muscle activity. So the axons are going to project laterally, basically meaning that the left brain will control the right side of the body. The next one we'll look at is going to be the premotor cortex, also considered to be the somatic motor control, so this red region, the darker red region. This part of the frontal lobe is important for coordinating learning, skilled motor activities such as playing a musical instrument. And then the frontal eye field, it's right in front of the premotor cortex, the light shaded red. And this frontal eye field is going to promote eye movements for reading or coordinating like binocular vision. And then the last area in the frontal lobe would be this Broca area. And within the Broca area, or what we consider the motor speech area, this region is responsible for controlling, it's the purple, this area is responsible for controlling muscular movement necessary for vocalization. So controlling all the muscles of the face for vocalization. The next region is going to be the parietal lobe. So when we're looking at the parietal lobe, the boundaries are going to first be described as terminates basically at the anterior or posterior position of the central sulcus, and then its boundaries are also going to run along the lateral sulcus, and then we have the parieto-occipital sulcus. So this region right here would be what we classify as the parietal lobe. The first area we'll look at is the postcentral gyrus, or the primary somatosensory cortex. This is the orange region. This postcentral gyrus, again, is a mass of nervous tissue. It's immediately posterior of the central sulcus. Basically, this area is general senses, evaluating shapes and textures of objects being touched, so basic sensory information. And then we start to get into these association areas, which this association area is the area of the pink. And association areas is essentially, it integrates new sensory inputs with past memories. So it's collecting information And any new sensory input, this area will help search to find the essential area of the somatosensory cortex where that sensory information should land. So the somatosensory area, uh, when we look at the somatosensory area, interpreting textures, temperature, pressure, shapes of objects, especially if the eyes are closed. And then moving on, we'll go to the temporal lobe. So the temporal lobe, again, in the posterior aspect will be bordered by the parieto-occipital sulcus, and on the superior area, we're going to see it bordering the lateral sulcus. It's mainly meant for hearing and smelling. We have a couple of association areas. So the first association area is the dark green area. And this auditory association area located in the temporal lobe is storing memories of sound. The primary olfactory cortex, so when we're looking at the primary olfactory cortex, it would also be in the temporal lobe. And the primary auditory cortex is where we're storing information on word sounds or sounds of words and syllables, things like that. The occipital lobe, which again the parietal occipital sulcus would be the main border for this lobe. The primary aspect, it's forming the posterior region of each hemisphere, so the right and left side. And its job is to process incoming visual information and storing visual memories. So we are going to have the primary visual cortex, so anything dealing with vision that information is going to be coming back to the primary visual cortex. And then we also have a visual association area where this area is going to analyze color, movement, and form, and basically puts the picture together for the primary visual cortex area. So some other areas that we have, the insula, which is the deepest layer of the cerebral lobes. And the insula is involved in interoceptive awareness, emotional responses, empathy, and interpretation of taste. The primary gustatory cortex is located inside of the insula. The next area is the Wernicke area. And this is the lightly white shaded area. It's located only in the left hemisphere. Its job is for recognizing, understanding, and comprehending spoken and written language. And then inside of the Wernicke area, we have the Gnostic area. And this is actually this area incorporates part of the parietal, part of the occipital, part of the temporal lobes. Basically, the Gnostic area integrates all sensory, visual, and auditory information being processed by the various association areas of the parietal, occipital, and temporal lobes. So when we're looking at a primary motor cortex, so this would be the central sulcus would be running just slightly posterior of this blue region. So this primary motor cortex is located in the frontal lobe. And we can see a primary motor cortex is primarily its job is for somatic information or motor control. And these bundles of neurons are going to control the voluntary skeletal muscle activity. And again, the axons are going to project laterally, basically meaning that the left brain controls the right side of the body. When we look at these, we call these the motor homunculus bodies. And basically, each region is going to be a different size based off of the number of motor homunculus bodies that are there. And it basically reflects the amount of cortex designated or dedicated to motor activity for each body part. So you can see in this illustration that we have a lot of a cortex dedicated towards the movement of the hands versus, say, for instance, the knee region. And it's specifically important to know that because we need that tactile or more nervous system intervention in this area for fine motor movement. So we see the same thing when we look at the primary somatosensory cortex. Again, when we're looking at the central sulcus would be dividing the somatosensory cortex from the motor cortex. So this is located in the parietal area. And again, what we're looking at is sensory information. So anything dealing with touch, temperature, pressure, pain. And these sensory homunculus bodies are going to be bigger in areas, such as the tongue, of course the lips, and the hands. So areas that have more of the sensory homunculus bodies are going to be associated with areas primarily for survival. So tasting, touching. So when we get into the central white tracts, remember when we're talking about any type of white matter, we're talking mostly composed of myelinated axons, and most of the axons are going to be in the form of a tract. So a tract is simply, most of the axons are grouped in bundles. So when we see these myelinated axons grouped in bundles, we refer that as a tract. We also have association tracts. These are going to connect different regions of the cerebral cortex within the same hemisphere. So the first one we're going to look at is the arcuate fibers. So that would be over here they're lightly yellow. So these are association tracts. They're going from different regions of the cerebral cortex. So we see some in the frontal, some in the parietal. But mainly what they're doing is they're connecting the neighboring gyri, or the folds, within the same lobe. They primarily connect the primary motor cortex of the frontal lobe with the premotor association area of the frontal lobe. So the two areas, if the central sulcus was here, and we have the two areas of the premotor association and the primary motor cortex, these arcuate fibers are connecting within that same lobe. The next one is going to be the longitudinal fasciculi. And the longitudinal fasciculi over here on the left side, this area is going to connect the gyri in different lobes of the same hemisphere. So what that means is it'll connect the frontal lobe with the occipital lobe in the left hemisphere. We also see this connecting in the area for motor speech, the Wernicke area. We see that these longitudinal fasciculi connecting the Wernicke area to the motor speech area. The commissural tracts, this dark stained blue, again, these are all myelinated axons. The commissural tracts extend between the cerebral hemisphere through the axonal bridges, and those axonal bridges are called commissurals. And the axonal bridges are located between the left and the right hemisphere. So we can see the longitudinal fissure coming all the way down. And when they're talking about axonal bridges, we're basically bridging the left hemisphere with the right hemisphere. They also, when they go through this, it's going to link the corpus callosum from the left to the right also. And the next one is going to be the projection tracts. The projection tracts are the green. So these are myelinated axons that are leading from the spinal cord up to this cerebral cortex. And these projection tracks are going to link the cerebral cortex to the inferior portion of the brain, including the brainstem, and then we're going to see it connecting into the spinal cord. These corticospinal tracts are carrying motor signals from the cerebrum to the brainstem and down, and they're also carrying sensory information up through the brainstem. So when we're looking at cerebral nuclei, one of the things that we have to understand is the difference between the cerebral nuclei and a basal ganglia. So both of them are a collection of cell bodies. The basal ganglia are clusters of neuron cell bodies outside of the central nervous system. So we tend to see basal ganglia or neuron cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. And when we're referring to a nucleus or a nuclei, we're looking at a collection of cell bodies within the central nervous system. So the cerebral nuclei are associated only with cell bodies within the central nervous system. So the first area we'll look at is the caudate nucleus. In the caudate nucleus, these neurons stimulate the appropriate muscles to produce the rhythm of the arms and legs during a walking motion. And you can also think of these nuclei of having stored memory. So these will be able to increase the signal of a rhythmic walk. The next one would be the amygdaloid body down here. It's this green region. And the amygdaloid body participates in the expression of emotions, control behavior activity, and development of moods. And then the next two are going to be grouped together. So the putnam and the globus pallidus, they are going to form what we consider to be the lentiform nucleus. So this region right here. Each one is, the putnam and the globus pallidus is going to have an individual job, but together we call this a lentiform nucleus. So the first one is going to be the putnam, and the putnam controls muscular movements at a subconscious level. And then when we're looking at the globus pallidus, which is slightly more medial, this will both excite and inhibit any activities of the thalamus to control and adjust muscle tone. And finally, the claustrum, which is the cerebral nuclei located more laterally. This is going to process visual information at a subconscious level. So again, we're just looking at a nucleus is basically a collection of neuron cell bodies within the central nervous system. So when we get into the diencephalon, this area right here, we consider this the in-between brain. It's going to incorporate the thalamus, the epithalamus with its structures, and the hypothalamus. So the diencephalon would be this whole region. The first one we'll look at, or basically the job of the diencephalon, is to relay and be a switching center for sensory and motor pathways and control of visceral activities. So this area, including the thalamus, would be more of the switchboard operator. It's going to dictate if sensory information, where it will land on the parietal lobe, and any motor information coming from a particular region, the thalamus will then send it down its appropriate axon tract to the effector. So the first one is the epithalamus. And the epithalamus is located more in the posterior region. So we have the habular nucleus, and we also have the pineal gland. The one that's most often talked about is going to be this small structure called the pineal gland, which is located in the posterior section. It is actually an endocrine gland. It secretes melatonin, and it's important in the circadian rhythm, so your sleep-wake cycle. The habular nucleus, which is also located slightly superior and posterior, This habnular nucleus is important for relaying signals from the limbic system to the mesencephalon, and this is the area where we contribute emotional responses to odors. And then going into the thalamus. So I just give you a little bit of a bigger view of the thalamus because it's one of the most important areas. So as the information is coming up, the sensory, we're going to land on these specific nuclei or neuron cell bodies in the central nervous system. So this is the final relay point for sensory information that's processed and eventually is going to be projected to the parietal region, specifically the primary somatosensory cortex. The job of the thalamus, it can filter out sound and sights in a busy room. It clues the cerebrum, so the cerebral cortex, about where sensory information is coming from. So one of the important aspects are these are bilobule, so they're actually separated and they have a connection called an interthalamic adhesion. And this is just a small midline mass of gray matter which is connecting the right and the left side of the thalamic bodies. And then you have a dozen nuclei, as I mentioned. These axons are projecting to regions of the cerebral cortex. So within this thalamus, we would have having axons that are going specifically to the regions of the primary somatosensory area. So all sensory information is going to come into the thalamus from all conscious senses except olfactions are going to converge on the thalamus in one nuclei. So the president of the autonomic nervous system is considered to be the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus can influence the heart rate, the blood pressure, all of your digestion activities, and respiration. Its job also in certain nuclei is going to produce or secrete hormones that are going to control the secretion activities in this anterior pituitary. So the hypothalamus will be releasing hormones that trigger the pituitary gland to then release its own hormones that can control metabolism, growth, different types of stress responses, or reproductive hormones. The hypothalamus produces an antidiuretic and oxytocin, which helps stimulate smooth muscle contractions in the uterus, the mammary glands, and also the prostate gland. The hypothalamus regulates body temperature, and it does that by sending signals for shivering or sweating. It is located in the limbic system, so this whole system in the diencephalon. And it also controls the limbic system, which is going to control responses of aggression, fear, rage, contentment, and sex drive. So this limbic system above can definitely influence the hormonal releases of the hypothalamus. More importantly, the hypothalamus monitors levels of glucose and amino acids in blood and produces sensations of hunger. It monitors your water intake, so it's monitoring your blood solute concentrations. And again, it's directing the pineal gland, which is located in the posterior section, to secrete melatonin. So inside of all of these, we're going to kind of go through a few of the more important nuclei. So the first one we're going to start with is going to be this one right here. This is the anterior nucleus. This area of the hypothalamus is important for monitoring the thirst center. It basically is going to stimulate your fluid intake. The next one, the arcuate nucleus, which is a little bit more inferior, so right here. The arcuate nucleus is going to regulate your appetite. The mammillary body, this area right here is going to control the process of swallowing. The preoptic area, so the dark purple, this is going to regulate your body temperature. The suprachiasmatic nuclei, very small. This is going to regulate your sleep-wake cycles and play a role in your circadian rhythm. The supraoptic nuclei, a little bit slightly superior. This is going to produce the antidiuretic hormone, which is important for helping to regulate blood pressure. And then the ventral medial nuclei, which is right here. This is going to be your satiation center, and this is what's going to produce senses of hunger or satiation or a sense of being full. So just a few examples of all the different nuclei inside of the hypothalamus.